All right, we are recording and I'm going to open the webinar now.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it a few minutes for people to get into the room. Wonderful. This is great. Looks like we've got a great crowd today. Just give it another minute or two for folks to get in. See some names I recognize on this list. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Looks like there's still some folks coming in, so we're just going to give it another second. Okay, so we are almost at 90 attendees, and so I think that's enough of a crowd for us to get going here. First, I want to say welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I think the response we got to this panel is evidence of how interested and excited everyone is about this topic and about our guests today. First, I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name is Corey Klemmer. I'm the Director of Engagement for Domini Impact Investments. We are a family of mutual funds that do exclusively responsible investing, and it's all built on our two core principles of universal human dignity and ecological sustainability. And so biodiversity really is at the heart of both issues. And we've been dedicating a lot of work in the past 2 years to, I mean, before that as well, but especially in the last 2 years to understanding systemic risks related to forest. And obviously land-based biodiversity is a huge component there. And so we'll dig into that more, but now I'd love to introduce our panelists. Gavin Edwards is from the World Wildlife Foundation and is running the New Deal for Nature and People. And Paula Ehrlich is the president and CEO of the E.O. Wilson Foundation, Biodiversity Foundation, is going to share with us the Half Earth Project today. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I think we'll just jump right into it. Maybe, Gavin, we'll start with you. First, maybe you want to introduce yourself just briefly, maybe let us know a little how you got into this space, and we could talk about, you know, where we're at today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Corey. Thanks for the team and Domini to bring us together as well. Really looking forward to having a good, robust discussion on biodiversity. So my role with WWF, with World Wildlife Fund for Nature, or World Wildlife Fund, is I coordinate our international initiative or program where we are hoping that in the next few months, governments, businesses, the finance sector, and a whole range of non-state actors are going to come together around a super agreement, a set of agreements that will chart a very different course for nature over the next decade. One in which nature is no longer declining, but is instead an aggregate recovering across the whole of the world. So that involves all sorts of things in my day job. But how did I get into this? I actually started back in Canada, in British Columbia, many 25 more years ago, going up the coast of British Columbia to a place called the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area. It was quickly named by a number of environmentalists as the Great Bear Rainforest, which we thought was a better reflection of the values of the place. and not just values in terms of the grizzly bears or the salmon, but also values to the First Nations communities that live there as well. So working alongside communities, working on forest conservation, and helping to turn that into a place which, instead of being logged with clear-cut logging, it now has a huge amount of protection, sustainable use, and community economic development opportunities within it as well. So a little bit about me and my role in WWF.
And I just want to say, I should have said this at the beginning. I got too excited. A few housekeeping details. I know everyone has been to 6,000 Zoom meetings and webinars in the last probably week. And so we're hoping to keep this very conversational, comfortable, relaxed. I think there's a lot of great content here. So I really encourage everyone who is attending, please just submit your questions as we go along, and we'll try to work them into our conversation. And also, in the interest of mixing it up a little bit, we have a few video pieces that we're going to share. And so maybe, Paul, if you just want to introduce yourself briefly, then I'll come back to the WWF piece.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Paula Ehrlich. I'm president and CEO of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and lead of the Half Earth Project, which I'm here to talk about today. And I get that if people don't know who E.O. Wilson is, that's a high bar for me. But for those of you who do, who have read his books, who have heard him speak, you know he has a tremendous ability to transform our lives, and that's worth paying attention to. I got involved with Ed many years ago, even as a student, and eventually our lives came together more formally through the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. And my own personal ambition to make a difference in the world. And I'm sure that's why a lot of people are on the phone today, just trying to find that unique way that we can each use our skills or expertise to care for our planet. About 4 years ago, though, Ed wrote a book called Half Earth. And there is this really cool chapter in the book, Half Earth, called The Lord God Species. And I want to mention it because not for the content per se, because you should all read the book, but because of the way it helped me realize and articulate the importance of what Ed had written, sort of the moment we're in. Ed's always written about the importance of transcendent moments of discovery and how important they are in compelling us to do something extraordinary with our lives and make a difference in the world. And in the Lord God Species chapter of Half Earth, Ed writes about naturalists, Lord God moments. You know, that moment when a pair of ivory-billed woodpeckers suddenly descends out of nowhere and you say, Lord God, what was that? So it's like naturalist heaven. And Lord God moments can come from anywhere at any time. For naturalists, it's when their world is like rocked by a new or rare or unexpected discovery. But my Lord God moment was the day I received that first draft of Half Earth. And I called Ed and said, this is a Lord God good book. And he was like, what? And I said, this is a Lord God good book. And he was like, what? And I realized he didn't understand my accent. So I had to say it a little bit more Southern. Ed's from Alabama. So I said, this is a Lord God good book. And he said, oh. And so you see, what he had done was write it all down and give us the words to convene around this really compelling idea. And that's what we're all doing.
Wonderful. And Paul, you have such an interesting background too. You have a PhD and you came out of pharma, is that right?
Yeah, I do. I have a really diverse scientific background in veterinary surgery, pharma, and biotech. I've also led some nonprofits, usually like leaning myself towards however I could use my skills and experience to challenge myself and be challenged by important problems of our time.
Amazing. Well, okay, I'm going to switch over to share this this video now. I hope it's going to work well for everyone. It's a great short little piece from Cool. So I hope that worked well for everyone on the line. For folks on the phone, I'm sorry you didn't get to see the video. It's really gorgeous and devastating. About 68% species loss since the 70s. It's wild. I did notice that you're calling for 30% of the Earth to be protected, and I'm pretty sure I heard Paula say half. So we'll come back to that later. But first, let's just dig in a little bit to what's happening, because we're coming from a financial perspective, and I know a lot of folks on the line are as well. And while we don't want to reduce this conversation to just about the price, there are huge implications for the financial sector and for companies and markets and our economies. And, if you needed any more evidence, 2020, COVID just turned the market upside down and several industries on their head. And obviously we can't say where COVID came from exactly, but we know that the pressure we're putting on ecosystems is increasing the human and animal interactions and increasing the likelihood of infectious disease like this. And we can talk through a little later on about the implications that's had for which kind of sectors, and as well as like the broader biodiversity loss implications for different sectors and companies. But why don't we just start with a state of play? Gavin, if you could just give us a little bit, I know you just put out a Living Planet report, and that, can you give us kind of some statistics, some stuff we can ground ourselves in for where we're at?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Corey. So, the Earth is in an awful lot of trouble. We've been tracking, scientists and researchers have been tracking since 1970 wildlife populations around the world. We have a data set of more than 2,000 wildlife species. And what we've seen is a 68% decline in populations in individuals across all the species. And that means that more and more species are being pushed further and further towards the brink of extinction. That was the headline finding from our Living Planet report, which we published with the Zoological Society of London in September. But it's not the only big finding that's come out in the last couple of years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is an esteemed set of researchers and scientists from around the world, backed by governments, estimated about 1 million species are on the brink of extinction. And now we may think of this as, that's a real shame, and these beautiful species we see on TV that are very far away, but it has very real human impacts as well on our food systems, primarily, and we can come back to that later, food being a big driver for the loss of biodiversity. We're losing intactness of areas as well around the world. So all of the headline indicators are going in the wrong direction, particularly for megafauna, but also for freshwater species. We've lost about 80% of freshwater species populations since 1970. So shocking numbers. So the challenge is, how do we tackle it?
If you could just translate that into some kind of real world things for the folks on the line, as a consumer, as a citizen, what does this mean for climate stability? What does it mean for the food systems? How does this all translate to our lives?
Sure, yeah. So, it translates on a couple of different levels, let's say 3 different levels. From the climate system, of course, runaway climate change was something we were facing a decade ago. We are still facing some really serious challenges in tackling climate change, but some progress has been made. Instead of a 4-degree Celsius world, we're heading for a 2.5 to 3 degree Celsius world now, which is catastrophic. But that number can and should and hopefully will be driven down. We haven't made as much progress on nature over the last decade or two. And this is where we think nature really needs a leg up in 2021, not just because of the intrinsic value of nature and the beauty of nature, but about 1/3 of the action needed to tackle climate change is based in nature and nature-based solutions, whether that is more sustainable agricultural practices and looking at soil carbon, or driving down deforestation rates, where we've seen a little bit of a slight uptick, particularly in Brazil in the last year, are just a couple of examples. So you cannot solve climate change without tackling nature and biodiversity loss. You cannot meet the sustainable development goals that the world has set for 2030. And about 80% of those goals are directly related to nature. You cannot meet those goals for development and for lifting the poorest around the world out of poverty without dealing with nature loss as well. And I think maybe we'll move on a little bit to this year. We've had a pretty rude reminder of what happens when you ignore nature. In fact, the science around pandemics has been clear for some years now, and it is this. If you continue to lose intact areas and have more incursions and more people moving in and out of intact areas, if you continue to have growing illegal, unregulated, poorly regulated wildlife markets, such as we see in parts of China with pangolin and other species being traded, if you continue to see runaway climate change, if you continue to see livestock, that is the livestock industry growing, then you are going to get more pandemics. That was essentially the science that's been settled quite a few years earlier. Nobody could estimate when the next one would come, but sure enough, it has hit us earlier this year. And as you were saying earlier, the impact is catastrophic. It's not about the ecosystem service value of a particular forest, of a particular tree species, of a particular fungi. It is a system-wide impact. Our economies have been pushed towards the brink of collapse and have required some very hefty interventions, which we're going to be paying for collectively for a long time to come. And the human toll, 1.5 million people lost their lives prematurely as well. So absolutely catastrophic. Catastrophic for parts of Africa and other parts of the world where they built tourism economies to protect wildlife as well. They're challenged now because people are simply not able to travel, are not traveling to be able to support some of these initiatives, these new economy initiatives as well. So a few examples of if we ignore nature, if we take nature for granted, nature unfortunately bats last. The consequences are system-wide, and then, of course, individually as well. We can get onto that later in terms of, from company and sectoral perspectives, the kind of impacts that industries will face as well.
But give me your 3 categories again. It's climate stability.
Yeah, I say, well, there's 5 in total. The top 3 that we really focus on are intactness of ecosystems and incursion into mostly intact ecosystems, illegal and unregulated wildlife markets, livestock and growing livestock and animal husbandry with the top 3. Climate change and a resistance to antibiotics are the other 2 as well. The 5 taken together greatly increase the chances of pandemics. And one recent estimate said that if we can get on top of these and really address these, it is 100 times cheaper, less expensive to address these than to deal with the cost of future pandemics. So there's also an economic case to be made system-wide.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're going to come back to what do we do and how do we address this and what are some of the financial tools as well. But first, I just want to come to Paula. And Paula, what have we missed? Why do we care about this besides, collapsing our economy and our, climate stability running away from us? What else is there that we need to be thinking about when we think about protecting biodiversity?
Sure. So as Gavin's pointed out so well, the problem is this, right? It's estimated that we'll lose half our planet's species by the end of the century. And this is because the extinction rate is currently 1,000 times higher than at any time in human history. So think about that, half our planet's species by the end of the century. And the issue is this: if we lose those species, we'll lose the ecosystems, the intricate web of life that sustains nature and sustains us as part of nature. And I don't know, do you know the game of Jenga? Yeah. You're never exactly sure which piece, when you pull it out, will cause the whole thing to collapse. And so Jenga's this game, right, that's played with 54 wooden blocks. And here's the tricky thing: our planet's made up of something more like 10 million species. And we know and have a name for only 2 million of them. So even if we try to be strategically smart about which ones it might be okay to lose, we know only about 20% of the players on the field and very little about their connections with the 8 million others that are unknown. So you might say we're playing a little in the dark in our attempts to care for our planet. What E.O. Wilson would say is, unless humanity learns a great deal more about global biodiversity and moves quickly to protect it, we'll soon lose most of the species composing life on Earth. But he also says this, that we, humanity, are passing through a bottleneck. And at the other end, if we pass through safely and take most of Earth's life forms with us, human existence could be a paradise compared to today. So number one, to get to paradise, we need to not just know what we're losing, we must know what species we have. And number two, we need to understand where we have the best opportunity to protect the most species.
This is all such great context setting, because in the financial space, we've been doing so much work. There's a lot of work proliferating right now about how do we price, how do we measure, how do we assess, how do we drive certain practices. And it's the idea of pricing biodiversity risk when we have 20% vision is an interesting challenge. And I'll just say that in the middle of COVID, I live in Queens in New York, and I'm about like a mile from East Elmhurst Hospital, which was at the height of the pandemic, probably one of the worst hit places in the world. And we were really pretty seriously locked down for I would say there was 6 weeks where we really were in this apartment, my husband and my daughter and I. And there was something that actually Claire, who organized this panel, sent me. It was like some group in somewhere in the Midwest, and they hosted like a forest bathing meditation. So I just randomly stepped into this Zoom meeting one morning, and they had someone walking through a forest and sharing their video feed of just trees, and even like a digitized version of it, dappled light coming through tree leaves. It was like still incredibly soothing. And then they had us do this exercise where it was like, remember one tree that you know in your life. Maybe it was next to the house you grew up in. Maybe it's you pass it on your way to work every day. And just imagine it and hold it in your mind and like sit with that for a minute. And then the little bit of silence and just sat there. And it was actually, the relief was so, the physiological relief was so noticeable. It was really, I'd heard of forest bathing, and I've seen the studies about how being in nature reduces all kinds of stress and cholesterol and cortisol, and has all of these great benefits for human health. But that was just like a very, very tangible example of it in this wild year we've had. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As we've shifted our frame of reference during the coronavirus, sort of seeing the world through the stillness of our rooms, my senses are inherent biophilia. That's our inherent connection with nature. Has become heightened. And along with this, I'd also like to imagine that we're all experiencing a budding hope, right? I mean, I know it's a hard time, but I imagine that it's also a time that's increasing our focus on the important stuff, allowing us to imagine that life could be a paradise if we want it to be. My sense is we're witnessing a heightened cultural awareness of the need for a hopeful solution for our planet. And when E.O. Wilson wrote the book Half Earth, he wrote about hope, kind of sharing equality with some of our greatest leaders. He wrote a book aimed at bringing out the best in people by inspiring collaboration, common purpose, and future possibilities. And of course, it takes hope to meet great challenges, and Half Earth challenges us to be the best we can be in facing a challenge that we intend to win, by the way. And I know we live in a time where science has sometimes been discounted or pushed aside, and sometimes its complexity sows doubt with uncertainty, creating skepticism, rather than a keen desire to learn and study more and sort of lean in. And so one of the things I'm hoping is the coronavirus has taught us is the importance of deep science, though, right? A real reverence for the important work of research scientists and the importance of collaboration and of sharing of that research in order to support our lives, that really nudges a shift in paradigm for that could have important consequences for how we think about our relationship to our planet and each other, and you and your tree, which I just love that story, and just pushes us to renew our scientific inquiry and to work together in support of goals like what Gavin's working on, and the inspiring moonshot like Half Earth.
Yeah, and that's like such a great segue. And I promise for our finance attendees, we're going to come around to all these frameworks and the political. There's a whole mess of things happening right now. We're going to come back to that. But starting with recognizing the importance of this, both what we can see and recognizing what we can't see also. I think this is a great segue to see a little bit more about the mapping you've done. And when you say half Earth, it's like, okay, which half, right? That's your question. So I think you have some tools to help us answer that. So are you able to share?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Hang on.
And while she does that, I'll just tell folks on the line, this is a website, you'll see the URL, and especially if you're on the phone, you can look up any address. And I actually put in my own address and checked out, like this is New York, you can imagine, but I looked up state, you can see what the local species are and what the threats are. And it's a very cool tool. I encourage you to check it out at some point. But go ahead. Thanks, Paula.
Oh, sure. Martin Luther King once said, if any movement will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people want to go to. So we've used the Half Earth map to help people imagine together what that could look like, which half, as you said, right? And to showcase the most effective path forward for protection of endangered species and endangered ecosystems. And here's the key: by mapping species at a really high resolution, the Half Earth Project map identifies the places where we have the best opportunity to protect the most species, right? And that then sort of provides the foundation for a new way of understanding how to best steward biodiversity while also supporting decision-making and creating a rich experience about why these places are special, right? Why we should care. But here's the thing, we talked about half and which half. Not all halves are equal. If the goal of half is ultimately, right, to leave no species behind, we need an indicator of how well conserved places are doing in protecting the species of their place and where we have the best opportunities to protect more, right? So we've also developed what we call a species protection index, which is, like a FICA score for biodiversity, right? So right now you can go to the Half Earth Project map and you can see a species protection index, an SPI report card for every nation. As you said, you can type in the name of the country you're interested in and get an SPI score from 0 to 100. And depending upon how many species groups are protected in your country. So the average is about 41 for most countries. And you get 100 if you've reached conservation targets for all your country's species within your protected areas. So here's how this works. In this map I've pulled up, I'm going to compare Mongolia, which is over here, to Israel, which is over here. Can you see my pointer? I'm sure you can see that.
Yeah, that's good.
So here's Mongolia, here's Israel, just to orient us. And now check out Israel, which has an SPI that's about average, right? 40.79. And it has 16% of its land in protected areas. You can see these protected areas here in green. And if we look and compare how Israel's doing compared to other countries, it's ranked 116 out of 252 countries. And up here is the US at 94. So that gives you a feeling not only for sort of how much land they've protected, how many species are there that are important for us to try to protect, but also how well they're doing in protecting the species of their place. Now, check out Mongolia. It's protected 16% of its land, but it has a blockbuster SPI of 89.14. So this sort of species mapping and the species protection index lets us know that Mongolia is doing really well and successfully achieving species conservation in the places it's protected. Again, these places that are in green. And the indicators like the SPI are key, right? Because the double bottom line is really how well you're protecting species within conserved areas. And that is what we need to measure our success as we work to achieve targets. So if you take a look here, if protection of land that doesn't also protect species doesn't increase your SPI. Israel's done a fabulous job of increasing their reserve coverage in green on the left here, and their species protection is earnestly increased with that. But by picking really well the best places to conserve, we can do even better in protecting the species of that place.
So Paula, we just had a question come in about how do you assess the quality of protection? Because protection could come in a lot of different forms. How do you determine if it's, they're effectively protecting the species versus less effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in the end, and this index helps us a little bit with that question, right? Because in the end, if we can conserve a place, but we're not managing it well to inevitably support the species of that place, then the species protection index would indicate that, right? Mm-hmm. And so these kinds of tools help us a lot with getting a better feel for whether we're managing places for conservation as well as we need to ultimately achieve this double bottom line, right? Species protection.
Is there, if folks visit the website, is there more on the methodology for the SPI?
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't want to get too deep into it because I didn't want people's eyes to glaze over. But I did want to say, all's not lost, right? Israel's report card also shows where to go next with one possible configuration of additional areas that could be protected in yellow, right? And in pursuit of the half Earth goal. And protection of yellow areas will contribute more to the conservation of species habitat beyond the current protection, which is in green. So the map is an extraordinary place to go visit. If you want it, and you can see every country on the map. Our friend Mongolia is up here in blue, and you can see where it's doing really well. And countries that are sitting up here are doing really well. The countries that are out here that are needing to take care of the greatest number of species are the ones that are most critical, right? And so this kind of index is going to be really important for the Convention on Biological Diversity's target 2, that is by 2030, to protect and conserve effectively protected areas and other conservation-based conservation measures on at least 30% of the planet, with the focus on areas particularly important for biodiversity. So the SPI has now been proposed as one of the headline indicators by the CBD to make sure we measure our success so we have a better chance of getting there.
That's wonderful. And so I want to let's talk about the convention, because that's a huge deal and it's coming up soon. But before we move on to that, can you just say a little bit about who's behind these maps, who you're working with to do this mapping?
Oh, sure. Well, we're mapping. I invite you to visit, and you can see our main pillar partners are Yale University. Our scientific chair there is Walter Yetz, leading an amazing team, not only doing the data analytics, but also having the species specialists on the team who understand the species around our planet. And we also work with Visuality, who are the map designers, if you will. Really important to engage people in this information and help them to see why these places are important. And they're in Madrid and in the UK. But the people who contribute to this map are really scientists everywhere. The data sets come from all of our work, both at a global level and a local level. And as we continue to populate the map with more and more data, we'll have a better and better sense of exactly what we need to do in order to protect half Earth.
So, Paula, you've given us our marching orders. What we do. But now the how. And so there's a lot of political stuff happening at the international level, at the nation level, and then the financial community, like I said, has just been the different initiatives are difficult to keep track of as they proliferate, it seems, in every direction. Sometimes overlapping and sometimes not. But let's just start with the convention coming up, Gavin, if you could, and what are the main things in play as we head into this is the Convention on Biological Diversity.
That's correct, yeah. So next year is going to be an important moment. The Convention on Biological Diversity will essentially be setting a 10-year action plan for nature. What can be achieved by 2030? The view from WWF and actually many, many other organizations is that within a decade, we need to see nature halted and the reversing of the loss of biodiversity so that nature is on a path to recovery. The idea of nature being in the positive by 2030. That will be a very lofty goal, a stretch target for sure, but also a necessity in the same way that a 1.5 degrees Celsius world is also a necessity as well. For the benefit of people and for the benefit of nature. The reason I put this infographic up now is because the first piece of work that needs to be done is spatial conservation. And Paula covered it very well in her presentation there. A goal of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030 we think is feasible. We're up to about 15% of terrestrial lands protected now, about 7% of marine. So a stretch target of getting to 30. And of course, it has to be the quality of the 30 as well. And that's where the tool that Paula shared is really helpful, focusing on species. And of course, we have incredible species diversity in tropical ecosystems. But spatial conservation is important. It's really important for communities and indigenous peoples. In fact, no spatial conservation should go ahead without the free, prior and informed consent of First Nations and indigenous communities. And that's something that we want to see hard baked into the Convention on Biological Diversity as part of the agreement next year. But spatial conservation is not the only perspective. Specific focus on recovery of species is also important as well. We have some success stories around the world. We're seeing tiger populations start to rebound in parts of Asia now, and particularly in Russia and India. Some good news stories there, and some early signs of that elsewhere, potential for the same to happen in places like Vietnam and Cambodia. Invasive species also need to be tackled as well, as somebody mentioned in the chat box. That's important for species, but there's a third perspective which we think is also equally important. And in fact, a recent publication in Nature really underlaid this. You cannot get to a recovery of nature by only looking at spatial protection and only looking at species conservation. You have to also tackle the drivers of conservation as well. And drivers can be looking at a procurement of products linked to deforestation. They can also be overconsumption as well. We know there's a huge amount of food waste in the world. There's an awful lot of plastic leaking into our oceans. There will be more plastic in the oceans than fish in the next decades by 2050 by one estimate as well. So you have to look at that and some of the human behavioral change that needs to happen along with robust support from business and the finance sector. So drivers are equally important as spatial conservation and species conservation as well. What we think is that as governments start to come together around this convention negotiation, which began more than a year ago, we think these targets can be locked in to a global agreement agreed by all governments to set nature on a path to recovery. We think that an implementing mechanism is needed. Don't wait for 10 years to see the progress made. There has to be commitments by every individual government in their territory to actually help reach the global targets. There has to be a cross-check and potentially a ratcheting mechanism. If the collective effort is not enough, 2 or 3 years down the line, it needs to be lifted so that we reach it. And lastly, there needs to be resource mobilization on a scale never seen before. And again, this is where the finance sector can help. Government funding can help, but it is not the long-term answer. We need the business models and communities that help provide for nature, which has benefits to people. And we need the finance sector to step up in all sorts of ways as well. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the call as well, Corey.
So, very interesting questions coming in. But just to kind of tie up what you just said, basically we could be looking at a Paris Agreement style thing for nature protection in May of next year. Yeah, and hopefully it will bake in certain like baseline things about maybe spatial conservation and potentially other components and targets. And like you said, they have to address the drivers. So I think there's, especially for the investors on the line, there's a few pieces here. One is, where are the drivers in our own portfolio, right? Like the risks of biodiversity loss, I hope are really clear. And I know there's a lot of content here, but like just thinking about the last year and the impact it's had on portfolios in different industries should just demonstrate a taste of what's possible in terms of the catastrophic expense related to biodiversity loss. So then the question becomes, how do we identify the drivers and address the drivers in our portfolios? And so Domini's been working on this forest project. Like I said, I mean, we've worked on deforestation for decades, but in the last 2 years have taken this really like, how do we intervene in the system in a new and different way that has more scalable change? Because the truth is, you know, we've been getting sustainable procurement agreements from companies for decades, and there were many commitments that companies made and governments made to ending deforestation by 2020, and huge commitments around biological diversity that with targets for 2020. And there's 10 goals from, I'm going to forget where the agreement was made, but the
IHE. Yeah.
Thank you. But so it's like the 10 goals, and there's progress on 6, but none of them will be met by this year. And that's true in certainly the deforestation commitments we've seen. There's the New York Declaration. And so just recognizing that we need a different approach to the next 10 years. And so I just want to kind of mention some of the efforts, both specific and then high level, happening in the financial community, because I think it's important for our audience. So where we had the TCFD, which is now very widely supported and adopted to report on climate related disclosures, there is a large group of international, both sovereigns and international bodies and financial institutions, and some other companies working in support of a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And Gavin, I'm going to ask you to say more about that in a minute. But there's also PCAF, the Principles for Carbon Accounting Financials, I believe. Now there's going to be PBAF, the Biodiversity Accounting Standards, which ostensibly would overlap with the TNFD on some level. There's another accounting methodology being developed by a group of BNP, AXA, Sycamore, and Morova. But then also insurance companies. I mean, insurance companies got hit by COVID every way you could think of, you know? And so I think where insurance, you know, if you're a life insurance company, you haven't thought about ecosystems too much before. I think that changed very quickly this year. But even, you know, if you're insuring events, you're insuring travel, you're insuring property, like the between COVID and natural disasters in 2020, I think there has been a very, very rapid reconsideration of these risks in the insurance sector and across the financial sector. So quickly, just on the drivers, I think we can, maybe Gavin, you can just name some of the key drivers, like at the sector level, because obviously the food system is very much both driving this and at risk of this. And then the financiers behind that have their own exposures and things to consider. And then there's a few financial products I want to talk about, but maybe you could just go through the drivers and say a little more about TNFD and when and what we can expect from that.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, some of the big drivers include, of course, forestry and the forest supply chain. Include fisheries. And links back to particularly the high seas, with fleets are going further and further into the high seas for their catches these days as well. So that's another sector. Of course, the food sector in general, which is cross-cutting, is absolutely massive and touches our lives in all sorts of ways. Then we also have the infrastructure sector as well, and initiatives such as China's Belt and Road Initiative is encouraging economic development in a set of key countries surrounding China, but it also has the potential to incur in key wildlife areas and promote wildlife trafficking and other challenges as well. So again, issues to be addressed within that sector too. Two of probably the more exciting things that have risen in the last couple of years to address this through nature. One is a business coalition. It's called Business for Nature, and essentially about 600 companies from around the world at CEO level, C-suite level, have essentially committed to do two things. Number one, be strong advocates for the conventional biological diversity and for a set of targets and actions around nature over the next 10 years. And secondly, look into their own supply chains and set much stronger targets than they've ever set before. And more are looking to the Science-Based Targets Network and having a more robust approach to target setting across their footprint as well, whichever sectors that they may touch. So on the business side, that's really important. And we saw 600 CEOs raise their voice last September through a big call to action. That was very important because a number of leaders around the world, about 80 world leaders, have now signed a pledge saying that they will work to reverse the loss of nature in the next decade. That's going to be really important going into that conventional biological diversity meeting. So a really good example of how the private sector and non-state actors can help encourage global ambition for nature. So that's business. We can also move on to a little bit the finance sector as well, and TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Again, we look pretty closely at the playbook on climate. A few years ago, a business voice raised up on climate and helped drive through the Paris negotiation. We mean business. The same happened on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure as well. Again, we're looking at that playbook now. An informal working group has been set up with a lot of banks and financial institutions, AXA, Wells Fargo, HSBC, Rabobank, and others, involved governments, the UK, Switzerland as well. And again, essentially coming at the same problem from the perspective of nature. What are the risks to companies because of the loss of nature? And that can be the loss such as the drying out of the Eastern Amazon, which is a climate impact that's forecast to be accelerating in the next decade. What does that mean for companies that are procuring supply in those areas or planning to make new investments, which could potentially drive deforestation? So through that one example, if you can start to make those investments and the risks from those investments much more visible, investors will begin to think twice. The cost of capital will be raised for companies operating as well. So this task force for nature-related financial disclosure, we hope it will be launched early to mid next year. Right now, there is an informal working group, and I'll just put a little link in the chat box there for everybody. If you want to find out more for the information available today, please do have a look at it, and please do assume that this is coming the way of the financial sector on nature in the next couple of years.
We're going to have hopefully a Paris Agreement on nature and a TCFD, but for nature, and potentially financial accounting standards on biodiversity. So all of this is coming very quickly. So at Domini, we have a process for reviewing these kinds of risks before we invest in a company. But then once we invest in a company, obviously this is not a problem that's been solved, and you can find these issues present in a lot of different companies, even companies that are really leading on the issues. And so my role as the director of engagement is to work with those companies and other stakeholders to push for progress on different issues. And I think some of what's so clear, has always been clear in our work, but really is that to be an actor at the system level, it can't be like a one-dimensional thing. It can't just be a screen or an ESG integration to say, here's the risk. We have to be proactively trying to address the risk and mitigate it. And there's, we could have a whole other conversation about managing beta and thinking about systemic risk as the driver of absolute return and why that's what we need to focus on as investors. But on this particular issue, I think something you said is so important is the policy component. It's one thing for companies to address their supply chain, but it's often not enough if we don't also address policy issues. And so having companies, and there's a great question from Jerome in the chat, and I'll do you one better, Jerome, mentioning the lobbying practices of companies and how do they participate in government, and are they supportive of environmental regimes or are they lobbying against them, is a huge deal. Like whether the law's on the books and whether they're enforced. And this has to do with both environmental protection and the rights of indigenous communities to their own land. And if those rights were upheld, we would be in a very different position than we are today. And so both advocating for strong regimes, strong legal regimes, and their enforcement is a key piece. So supporting the international dialogues is important, but also the more direct, how do you participate in the places where you have a footprint with your business? The thing he put in the chat, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, because Domini has joined the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, and we invite everyone on the line to join, and I'm happy to speak to anyone offline about what it entails. But there are, I think we're up to 37 different signatories now, global investors, and we commit to 5 things by 2024. And I think this will hopefully get to one of the earlier questions also about what are the main roadblocks. And because I think these are trying to address some of them, but it's about the 5 commitments are collaboration and knowledge sharing, engaging companies, assessing impact, setting targets, and reporting publicly. And you can see just between those and the other initiatives that we've mentioned so far, there's a lot of efforts going on to understand how you would price such a thing. How can you incorporate the value of these ecosystem services? And there's a challenge here, right? Because as we talked about earlier, there's the things that we know, and there's some things that we know that we don't know. And then there's things that we don't know that we don't know. And so putting a price on something that we don't fully understand is an inherently limited exercise, right? And it opens up to all kinds of other risks where we might think that we're protecting something, but we've just offered a license to destroy something that we still don't fully understand. But like I said, those efforts are ongoing, and it's an important piece of the puzzle. We can't be confused and think it's the whole puzzle. I think that's what I'm trying to say there. But so now that we've got just a few minutes left, I do encourage everyone to send in their questions. I have one about collaborating with NGOs and impact investors. I think that there, like I said, proliferation of efforts, especially heading into the international dialogues. And so please reach out to us at Domini. If you guys are comfortable sharing your contact information or the contact of your organizations, we'll happily send that out in follow-up materials. We'll also share links to all of the materials that they mentioned. And just looking if there's any other questions we didn't answer, because if we didn't, I'd love to just chat about something, I think it was in the Times over the weekend, about a new insurance product insuring coral reefs, which I did not realize coral reefs were animals. But apparently it's just they grow little exoskeletons and they keep growing. And coral reefs also take down the force of a wave by 97%. And so a coastal community bought an insurance product to insure the coral reefs off of their beaches, because both the tourism that the reefs themselves draw and the protection they offer to the beaches are essential. And so it's such an interesting, you talk about financial solutions to these things. Being able to insure the reef it supported, I don't think it worked perfectly, but it supported the community to go out and repair the reef, which apparently if you attach coral back fast enough, it will regrow to the whole, and you can actually save pieces that were hit by a hurricane. And they were able to set the policy based on the wind speed and what it would cost to repair. And so it was just a very interesting new approach, but then it also raises the question of ensuring that isn't sustainable if you aren't also working on other mitigating strategies to protect nature and climate. So I just thought that was a super interesting example. I'm going to look at some of these, but I wonder if you guys have any reactions to that or if you saw that piece as well.
Go ahead, Paula, if you'd like. Otherwise I'll jump in. Coral reefs. I mean, they're the twin threats of overfishing and short-term impacts, and then the longer-term big impact around the collapse due to climate change and ocean acidification as well. So in an awful lot of trouble. But looking at the most resilient reefs around the world that will be able to cope with what's coming in terms of a warming ocean, that is the big priority for a lot of the conservation community around the world. And there are all sorts of blue bond initiatives raising where for figuring out how to get some capital and some investments into communities to protect those reefs for what's to come is going to be absolutely essential. Yeah. Just looking at the questions as well.
It's super remarkable, both the value that they provide to the community and then the multiple threats that they're facing and how do you contend with them. And the role of insurance in this is especially fascinating to me because they're one of the kind of actors that sits at that super high level where they're in a position to, their whole job is to move risk around, right? And reallocate risk and spread it around so that it's manageable. And this is quite a challenge in that context.
Yeah, and Corey, I really appreciate you speaking to the known unknowns and all of that because we have earnestly, right, worked to protect nature for a long time, as you alluded to earlier. We've earnestly put out fires here and there, and it sounds like we might be doing that now with coral reefs, which is wonderful. And yet we know that that extinction rate is still going up. We know we're still losing biodiversity. And Ed tells a funny story. It's like a surgeon hovering over a bleeding patient in the operating room, and heroically stops 20% of the bleeding, right? You know, congratulations, the patient's still dead in the morning, you know. And so it really highlights how we must really understand not only the species of these places, their interactions within their ecosystems to support our lives, and the complexity of it. If we're really going to solve this problem, we really do need the research that can inform a policy like you read about this weekend, so that we're not just modeling what might happen, but we know. And we're probably at a stage now where we can do this in a way we never have before, right? We have big data, and we have remote sensing, and we have a lot of technology that would allow us to really dig in and get this done.
I'm going to try to answer some of these questions that have come up very quickly. There's one about your name, Paula, that I'll leave in the chat for you. But about how Domini is trying to drive the transition, I just suggest you look at our website. And in particular, we have a landing page, domini.com/forests, and you can see how we're thinking about value creation in that context. We're really, Gavin said it before, being nature positive. We've been trying to move companies to being forest positive. We've spent a decade trying to get to slow down the loss. And I think the conversation we've had today, it's clear we need to be thinking more ambitiously about, no, how do we actually start adding back to the system? How do we add resilience and strength? The idea that we're going to like just work around the complexity of it and you know, play this very reckless Jenga and just see what happens is, I don't think it does not create a sustainable system, including a sustainable financial system. But so we have a bunch of thoughts on the website. Samantha, I encourage you to check that out. Tommy, how do we hold companies accountable? It's a great question. It's important. And I think it's a reason for all of us to partner. NGOs, the scientific and academic community, impact investors, larger financial institutions. And I think there are a lot of folks open to those alliances. And it's a tough relationship, you know, because we work with activists and including to the last question I received, we work with indigenous communities, we work with racial justice organizations, and we try to, you know, bridge the divide between what companies are saying they're doing and what we're hearing on the ground from stakeholders and with worker groups also. And it's not always easy, but I think it's an important push in the right direction. And it keeps, you know, you have to keep balancing all those competing forces to keep this moving forward and towards progress and towards this goal of 30 to 50% of the planet.
Yeah. Maybe just a final thought as well is that 2021 is shaping up to be a super year for nature. It's that rare once in a decade opportunity where if we can come together as finances, as investors, as businesses, as civil society, as governments, we can set a North Star, Southern Cross for where we need to be in 10 years' time. Once we get that locked in, if we're invested more of ourselves in nature conservation, the benefits will be clear: avoiding pandemics, tackling climate change, the beauty and intrinsic nature of value. It'll be there for future generations as well. So anything that anyone on this call can do to raise their voice in 2021 in support of action that's the shot that we need for nature in the next few months. And it's really good that we've had this conversation today to help set that up. So yeah, thanks, Corey.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining. We still have 75 people after an hour. I really appreciate our panelists. I think this was so interesting. It's a great perspective to add to the conversation in the financial community. And I hope this was interesting for everyone that joined. And I hope we can keep the conversation going. You know, we'll see if there's any questions we didn't get to and try to answer them offline, and invite everyone to just stay part of the conversation. You can contact Domini, and like I said, we'll share contact and follow-up information. Thank you guys so much. I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you to everyone that joined from home. Really enjoyed this. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Lovely to speak,
Corey,
Gavin.
well. Thanks, Dominique. Thanks, Paula, as well.